Hello, homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Trip, and on the podcast is Eric Vanden Eykel. Oh yeah, definitely had to ask how to pronounce his name, but he is the author of a brand new book, The Magi: Who They Were, How They've Been Remembered, and Why They Still Fascinate Us. So Eric, thank you for joining the podcast after multiple friend recommendations.
Well, Trip, thanks for having me on. I'm really looking forward to it.
Oh yeah. So now to go and write a book on the Magi, and this is not just any book because it doesn't just spend 200 pages looking at the 12 verses in the Gospel of Matthew where the Magi exist, but to look at the Magi and the history of the kind of fascination with them. What's the origin story for a New Testament scholar to then do this kind of broad history of interpretation?
Yeah, so I talk about that origin story a little bit at the start of the book, but really it came out of a question from my dissertation defense in 2014. One of my committee members just said, why don't you really talk about the Magi in this text that you were working on? And I just kind of I waffled a little bit and said, they didn't really do anything for my argument and whatever, but and they really didn't. But that question sort of planted in my brain a little bit. And the next week I started just looking at biblical commentaries, and I started doing a bit of library research for, let's see maybe what the Magi in Matthew kind of are doing there. And around the same time, I had gotten, I was approaching the end of my doctoral studies, and so I was doing that thing where I was kind of panicking about what was next.
Oh yeah.
And I know that nobody else probably that was probably just unique for me, right? It's like what's next?
What's next?
Well, so I had read like a blog post or something around that same time. I think it was Roland Bohr's blog post, and he talked about like after you've done your dissertation and all that, like figure out something small, something related, something like you could spin off into like a short little book or whatever, just sort of keep productive or keep momentum or whatever that was. Anyway, so I was thinking, well, maybe the Magi would be that for me. But really, the experience that I had when I was looking at these characters in the scholarly literature was just I wasn't very satisfied with the explanations that I was seeing. I thought they were all a bit flat and not all that interesting. But then that combined with what I found when I started poking around online, it's like that's a trip, right? I mean, when you're looking online at these characters, you get all sorts of like secret brotherhoods and like necromancy and all of this kind of stuff. And I thought, well, maybe this is actually a good book to write, is sort of like, who were they in Matthew and how have they been used?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, I love a Roland Bohr shout out. For those that don't know him, go check out when he's been on the podcast. Quite a hoot.
Yeah.
So when do you have your first memories of how you were introduced to the Magi growing up?
Yeah, so I mean, I grew up United Methodist. I grew up just in that kind of world, pretty centrist. Boring is what I describe my Methodist background. Is sort of not all that interesting. I was never really a fundamentalist or anything like
Very
that.
Welch's.
Right, exactly. But no, I kind of grew up with them as familiar characters. We had a nativity on our table in our living room, and so I kind of grew up seeing them and seeing them in nativity plays and these sorts of things. One of the really cool memories, which I also talk about in this book, is I had an uncle, my uncle Stu, who he passed away a couple of years ago, but he one Christmas he brought these blue glass vases that he had made for my mother and my grandmother, and they were sandblasted and etched, and so they have these images of the Magi on them. And then the caption on my mother's, which she still has somewhere, the caption is "Wise men still seek him." And he's like, it's got the star and it's got the camels and all that. And my grandmother's was actually in Dutch because she was Dutch, and he liked to kind of play with that a little bit. But I think in hindsight, that was one of the moments where I kind of started thinking differently about biblical texts and sort of what those things are doing, right? Because he had taken these characters that I had just sort of said, well, yeah, they're in the Nativity. They obviously came to Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Matthew says they did. And those vases, when I looked at that, I thought, what he's doing there is taking and making them into models, right? And so like people who you're supposed to emulate in some way. Like, what does it mean to seek Jesus? And at the time, that was kind of a very appealing question for me. So, but yeah, I'm in that place where I grew up with the Magi, and then kind of in various stages thought differently about them.
Mm-hmm. So when you're in the classroom and introducing the Magi, but in general, the Christmas stories, right? Though that's one of those places, and I'm sure everyone that has taught undergrad religion classes has had this, where you realize you're actually in the room of people with more expertise and familiarity with everything you are supposed to teach them than you, and it runs up with this experience where the students look at you and go, "Oh, Eric, don't you understand? The Magi rolled deep with the shepherds, right? They hang out. I know this. I have pictures to verify at my very biblical church, how they go." So like when you think of these, the Christmas stories more broadly, and then trying to focus on the Magi, what are those kind of assumptions that frame the narrative that kind of have to be bracketed at least to engage the text as it is?
Yeah, so I think, I teach in the South, which is a whole thing, right? And so my students, when they are coming to the classroom, you've described them very, very well. Many of them do assume a certain level of not only familiarity but expertise in these texts. Now, that's actually different. The claim of expertise is different from actually having read any of these texts, because I think a lot of folks, even folks
alternative expertise.
Well, right. Oh, that's a good, yeah. No, but I think a lot of folks who are sort of in that world, and who are ingesting these biblical stories, I think a lot of times they, in their minds, they have read a lot more than they actually have. And so if I ask my students, to tell me about, like, the story of Jesus's birth in Matthew and the story of Jesus's birth in Luke, they're sort of unaware that these are two different stories. So when I'm in New Testament class, one of the assignments that I give them really, really early is to essentially put these two stories in columns, and to highlight the differences, the very, very real differences, right? And then also to kind of look for the things that they expect to find, or that they thought were there that aren't. And so, one of the greatest example of this is in Luke. Everyone, when they're reading Luke, assumes that Jesus is born, in a stable, and there's no stable in Luke. I mean, there just isn't. There's a manger, but there's no stable.
Have you considered Charlie Brown?
I've heard he started to be recognized more and more.
Yeah.
As an authoritative source. No, but another character in Luke who just isn't there is the innkeeper, right? I mean, there's this kind of, the innkeeper who turns away Mary and Joseph. Well, I mean, that character doesn't actually appear. Your mind kind of fills that in. And so, but anyway, yeah, like looking at these stories and sort of forcing them to come to grips with the fact that they're two different stories, and what are the ways that people have harmonized them, like your nativity, right? That has the shepherds on one side and the wise men on the other. That story doesn't exist, at least not in a single kind of form. But that's extremely unsettling. And I think, every semester is kind of different depending on, depending on the group. And also I find that the spring semester is a little harder because they're just coming off of Christmas.
They just got to refresh.
Right. And they say, well, no, I saw the Christmas play at my church, and so I already know this, so I don't have to do the reading.
My brother was a Magi, and my sister was an angel.
Yeah.
And she was next to the shepherds, and they were in the same place, and then they sang "Hark the Herald Angels Sing." Eric,
Yeah.
do you know that song? I bet you're going to tell me "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" isn't in the Bible either.
Now, you know what? I'm not going to tell you that, but yeah, I mean, big if true, right? I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that people who you grow up in their relationship to scriptures primarily as a sacred text and then enter the academy is figuring out all the different ways kind of critical scholarship learns to relate to text. And one of those ways historically in modernity has been to try to get behind the text to figure out, oh, what's the historical Jesus or the historical Magi, for example, and that kind of thing. And I think early in your book, you kind of look at it, but also posit a different way of engaging these stories to really look at them and really take time to see how come this text has fascinated us, right? Like, unlike the story of Jesus, there's not lots of other sources and things to build on and go on. So then, like, how as a scholar would you say, look, maybe the history question is probably not the fruitful one here. And if we just want to see what's going on in this text and recognize the way even, faithful Christians have misread and then taught misreadings, like, how do you invite us to wrestle with the text anew?
Yeah. Well, obviously that question of historicity, right? Did this actually happen? That's one that a lot of people are bringing to the text, and I think particularly if they are coming from a background where they're reading these texts devotionally, right, or religiously, and then they're kind of confronting critical biblical scholarship where people are not really asking that question of historicity. I mean, sometimes certainly there's some scholars who are, and perhaps are even reveling in proving that certain things didn't happen. But it really is just kind of a different set of questions. So the way that I think about it is that I try to think about what's available to us for examination and what's not, right? And so the stories about Jesus's birth, I am one of those one of the many who believes that Jesus was a historical person. I don't think that there's any compelling evidence to suggest that he was created by the Romans or whoever is said to have created Jesus. It's like, if you're going to create a foil, that there's some details that probably would be different. But anyway, so I think Jesus is one of these
Eric,
people.
God created everything, so obviously he gets credit for Jesus, right?
Well, right.
Come on.
Yeah, I'm just, you know what, Trip, I'm trying to keep up here. That's
I know. I was trying to guess what that was my question the undergrad asked back. They get distracted by the word created. And you're like, well, didn't God make everything?
It's so funny. I remember, if I can just kind of go on a tangent here before I
I
come
support
back to
tangents.
Bethlehem. God created tangents too. I don't know if you realize that.
Yeah, well, like maybe an escape all the way down to Egypt and back. You never know.
Yeah. Hey, so let's go to Egypt for a second. And by Egypt, I mean one of my first undergraduate classrooms. And I remember sitting in a New Testament class, and I remember our professor was talking through the letters of Paul, and he said something that at the time very much unsettled me. He said, scholars don't actually think that Paul wrote all of these letters. He thinks that, scholars think that Paul wrote, these letters definitely, these letters maybe, and then these letters absolutely not at all. Like, and the absolutely not at all being 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. And
the ones with the most cringe.
Yeah, they're super cringy ones. And this is also very convenient, right? It's like, oh, Paul definitely didn't write those. Well, they're still in the Bible, so we kind of have to you kind of have to still deal with them. But anyway, I remember opening up my Bible, and I opened up my Bible to 1st Timothy, which begins with Paul, an apostle or whatever, however he starts it. But 1st Timothy claims to be written by Paul. And I remember leaning over to the person sitting next to me and pointing at that and being like, gotcha, right? Hey, this guy, yeah, boom. This guy says Paul didn't write 1st Timothy. And here it is right here. Author says that he's Paul, and I remember asking the professor after class, And if he is listening, then he is going to, maybe he'll remember this. And I think he had a similar story. But I remember asking him after class, have you ever noticed that, you know, First Timothy claims to have been written by Paul? So, and I kind of just, and he looked at me and he says, well, if I was going to write a convincing forgery, I suppose that that's how I would start it as well. And I just laughed, like, and I of course left with that sort of like Homer Simpson attitude of like, everyone is stupid but me. And anyway, so that was sort of that it's that kind of circular logic though, right? Like, well, it claims to be written by Paul, so who are you to say otherwise? Well, okay. Anyway, so the the question of historicity, right? Like, I don't doubt that Jesus was a historical person who was born. If he was a human, that he was born, he had a mother and all of these sorts of things. But what can we know about his birth? I mean, in terms of the actual like hard evidence, there's nothing, right? There's as much evidence for Jesus's birth in terms of the material evidence. There's as much evidence for that as there is for mine and there is for yours, right? So we know that he was born, but what are the details? Well, we're not sure. So what we can focus on, what's available to us, is the story in Matthew, the story in Luke, other stories that exist about the birth of Jesus, how those stories have been understood. And we can analyze those to say, not necessarily this is absolutely how it happened, but this is how these authors are telling that story.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And the same thing is true for the Magi, right? If you are, if you're looking for a book that's going to prove the historicity of the Magi, I mean, there's options out there that try to do this. They do it very poorly, in my view, but they try to do this, and it's a fruitless enterprise because they miss the point of the story. So my position in this book is like, I'll be honest. Personally, I don't think the Magi were real people. I think Matthew either made them up, or I think that he is importing another story that was created. But at the same time, this book is not about disproving the historicity of the Magi story. I say very clearly, hey, if you want to believe the Magi were real people, that's fine. It doesn't matter. But let's talk about what the story means. And that can either pair with, I believe the Magi were real, or I believe that they weren't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that that I find helpful about that bracket that you offer in the book, even if, right, like, okay, the historical critical scholarship is not going to have a very vibrant live case for the historicity of Magi, but I think the greater gift, I think, of both bracketing the question, but also what you're doing in the book is to go, what if that's just like the worst question to ask when you get to what Matthew's doing with the Magi? There are 12 verses there, and if you think the whole birth narrative, the Christmas story in Matthew, is something that's truth, is ultimately something to be demonstrated, argued for, verified, and such historically, then you actually miss what Matthew's doing. I think that recognition is really important for people who spend too much time being either defensive about the history fight or aggressive. Right. So I regularly get messages, probably will after this, from people who are like, I can't believe you have another interview where you take seriously fairy tales. There's no God and no Magi, and it's a waste of time. Followed by an email or someone's like, you're just trouncing over the Bible. If there's no historical Magi and star, there's no meaning or purpose in the universe, and we're all avoiding finitude and believing fairy tales. And I'm just like, whoa, chill out. And the coolest thing about your book, I think, is that not only in the first half where you take the text seriously as a piece of generative fiction that can capture you, or myth or parable or whatever language you want to use, but you also then go, it's actually functioned this way in beautiful and terrifying ways throughout its history. So when you kind of invite people into the text as a kind of a place for generative wrestling, how do you start that with undergrad students when so much of our public square religion debate is sounds like 18th century epistemology?
Right. Oh man. Well, one of these days when I actually figure out a way that works consistently, I'm gonna package it and sell it, and it'll be
You mean after you come back on Homebrew Christianity to tell everyone? Yeah.
well, yeah,
Yeah.
but I mean, at that point, my price tag might be too high. So,
Well, I'll write an endorsement though.
okay,
Be
that
like,
would work. Yeah,
Eric
yeah.
dominates the Bible
Mm,
on its
mm,
own behalf.
I like that. I like that. Um, no, I think it's so tricky because again, classes and students have different personalities. So what works for one is just really is not going to work for the other. You know, one of the things when we are kind of wrestling with that question of historicity, or the word that I really, really hate, inerrancy, right? Because what is that supposed to mean? And I have students every now and again who will say things like, "Well, I believe that if the Bible is not correct in every detail, that it is worthless," or something along those lines. And I mean, my unhelpful response to them is, "Well, I guess it's worthless then." And I don't actually mean that. I mean, keeping in mind that I'm a professional biblical scholar, I actually don't think that it's worthless. I think that it's quite interesting. But there are spots that we point to and we say, well, these things aren't correct in the sense of how we normally think about things being correct, right? You know, we look at for example, the creation stories in Genesis, two different stories, just like we have with Matthew and Luke, two different birth stories. But
You got to
I
give
mean,
a trigger warning to the right people.
right? I should preface this with saying, like,
Yeah.
okay, we're all still gonna.
I think we're safe. We're safe. It's just sometimes you've already told them there's two Christmas stories, two
Okay.
creation stories.
Oh my gosh.
Just wait till you
Yeah.
find out there's 4 passion stories.
Oh
It's
my gosh.
oh,
Yeah.
sorry,
Yeah.
friends.
I don't want to cross anyone.
Wow.
There we
Well
go.
done.
Oh, you had that right on hand, didn't you? That's good.
Well, I just saw your pre-smirk for your joke. I thought he's a professor. It'd either be good or cheesy.
Yeah, you got to get it ready. You know, that one actually came. That one came to me in a moment this last semester, where we were talking about crucifixion, as one does in a New Testament class, and I made the comment as like, I sort of like I felt it sort of welling up inside of me, like whatever, and I just said, crucifixion really is sending the message that this is what happens when you cross the Romans. And the entire room got really, really quiet. And one student in the back, he raised his hand. He goes, "Did you just make a joke about the death of Jesus?" Like, I did. And then I said, I nailed it too. And there you go. Thank you. So anyway, but
Student loans, that's what you get. All right.
exactly right. No, but so like looking at all these stories, right? Like, let's talk just about Genesis 1, right? Is this story correct and accurate and scientific and all of this? Like, no, it's absolutely not. It's a story. It's a story about the order of the cosmos, and it's a story about things other than how did the universe come to be. And you see this at a number of points in the story, right? These inconsistencies. Light is created before the things that make light. Uh, you know, um, Vegetation is created before the sun. Um, and like the author is counting by days before the sun exists. So like, how are we counting by days if the sun is not rising and setting, right? The story doesn't hold up if you're looking at it as a scientific account of the creation of the earth. And so we sort of, but the way that I try to do this, and again, with varying levels of success, I use fables a lot to talk about the idea of meaning and truth, and then also accuracy. So the great one that they've heard usually is the tortoise and the hare, and we talk about, we read that story and we talk about what it means, right? And so what does it mean? Well, don't be cocky. Slow and steady, pacing is important, all of those things. And then I asked them, so where's the tortoise buried? Because the tortoise isn't alive anymore, because this is an ancient story. What was the hare's name? Where were they exactly? And they're like, well, those things don't matter, because this is a fable. Now, the leap there that is still a hard leap to make is, are you saying that the Bible is a fable? Well, I'm saying that some of the stories are on that same level of, these are being told for meaning, not for historical reality or whatever. But it is a conversation that I think takes, for some students, it's like a light switch. For some students, they go, oh, this makes perfect sense. And they've been sort of waiting for that explanation. And for a lot of them, it's going to take the whole semester. For a lot of them, I get emails occasionally from students from a few years ago, and they say, something just clicked from your class, and that's great. Like, better late than never, right?
Yeah. Yeah. There's a parallel to that. I've had when teaching philosophy of science classes, when people that come in, I wouldn't label them this directly, but that are basically fundamentalist materialist, and they assume a kind of whatever the word meaning gets attached to is something that ultimately is explainable by empirical science. And after spending looking at all those dead ends philosophically when it goes to philosophy of science, and then kind of the ongoing quest to even figure out how do these different individual empirical kind of research projects connect to a larger picture, and then thinking like when they realize all the dead ends, you'll get these emails. You're like, so how do we even have meaning and purpose? Like, blah, 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 blah. Because if this is all we have, right? And I'm like, just to clarify, you have experienced meaning and purpose and love. So you may not have a picture where it's all included in the world yet, your picture, but your experience of the world has it.
Right.
And if you're telling me, it's wrong to explain it away as just genetic fan fiction, even though genes, chemicals, all that stuff's a part of it, then maybe that is empirical evidence from your first person experience that an account of the world needs to be deeper, richer than you've assumed. Right. And I think the same kind, and it's fun philosophy conversations, but it's something similar, I think, to people of faith when they start to engage sacred text in different lenses, right? Where if they're like, no, the only way I could come to grips with my guilt over the worst decision I've made and how I harmed someone, or what animated me to forgive so-and-so, or to get invested in this justice movement, or whatever their faith animate. The only way that's true is if insert your empirical claims about history or whatnot. Right. And that same move is there. So to me, one of the fun things about those conversations in philosophy of science, and then helping people read text and see that meanings there, is to go, one of our big inheritances in modernity is the kind of myth of a flattened picture of the reality. And that somehow to say, this past week in the Advent class with Dom, he talked about Matthew, spent all this time on it, that as this theological prologue to a gospel that captures this particular gospel's, energy, like to go like the truth of it is ultimately about a Magi and where they came from, or if the 5 prophecies are really fulfilled. It's just missing the point.
Right.
No one goes up to I remember the first time I sang my to-be wife a love song. It wasn't like, so exactly how am I like a Wookiee? Because there was a reference that you'll be my Chewbacca.
This is great.
And those kind of things. Or like you hear a love poem and you don't go, it's true. It's not true in the same way a syllogism is. They're just different.
Right.
and I say it because one of the things I loved about it, I think it's in chapter 2 where you talk about the vision of meaning when you're going to a story is different than when you're asking those historical questions.
Right. Yeah. The stories, we are always bringing our own lenses, and we're always bringing our own experience. And that's one of the things that I think more recent years of biblical scholarship have sort of brought us, is this sense of that subjectivity is not only okay, but it's just a thing. Right. And so this idea, it used to be the case. And I think that some people who still don't quite understand what biblical scholarship is, are operating under the assumption that what we're ultimately after is, who's the I'm forgetting the reference now. It's old classicist who talked about how reading these ancient texts, we're supposed to read them like we would any other book and find ourselves alone in the mind of the author, or something along those lines. And it's like, this idea of pure objectivity, and that is ultimately the meaning of a text, is getting inside the mind of the author and to kind of understand everything from the author's perspective. And it's like, well, I mean, no, I think objectivity, I think it's important to be able to bracket some of our own preconceived notions, but we're always coming to the text. We're always coming to any story with our own experiences of the world. And yeah, and that's how that's how meaning is made. And that is a good thing that more recent years have brought us.
Yeah. So when you look at the 12 verses in Matthew, and you attempt to do that task that you spend a little bit of time on the book and doing, and thinking about what Matthew's up to through the characters of the Magi, if we've all successfully bracketed the history questions and go, all right, Eric, all right, we'll let you, at least for a couple questions, address the meaning of the story as a story. What features come to the fore? What kind of questions do you think Matthew, the author, is putting towards us, the reader?
So, yeah, what I think I do, what I try to do as I'm kind of getting into this story in Matthew is I'm trying to not only situate it in the first century and to kind of take a look at vocabulary. That's one of the things that I do a lot of is asking the question of, what are these other characters called Magi who are outside the biblical text? How, who are they? And so kind of, I'm trying to situate that story within Matthew's bigger context, because Matthew is obviously not, he's not just reading the Old Testament. Matthew is an educated person. He's reading broadly, and he's got a lot more going into it than just that kind of limited vocabulary. And his readers are the same way. But I think that one of the questions that Matthew is posing, and also trying to give, trying to give readers an answer, but also really trying to get them to elicit this answer out of their own knowledge, is this question of who and what is Jesus? And not really as much theologically at this point as I make the case politically, right? So who is Jesus? And for Matthew, I think the answer to that is the rightful king of the Judeans, the one born king of the Judeans. And so I think that the Magi story is one of the final nails in the coffin of that case that he's trying to make, right? But I think that starts in the most boring way possible in Matthew's genealogy, right? So who starts? Let me ask you this. When you met your wife and she said, "So tell me a little bit about yourself," did you start with your great grandfather?
Well, no, I did start with my great grandfather, because we share a name.
Yeah, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
Reasonable. Yeah.
But too far back, my family have some really embarrassing features in it. And our family history says, well, we do not know this for sure, but it has been rumored that Moses himself was a fuller.
Wow.
And just, we're not Jewish. So, yeah.
That's incredible. I don't know if I've ever met anyone related to Moses before, even allegedly.
Well,
it's incredible.
Well, you're welcome.
Yeah, that's great. That's I'll cross that.
We're going to bracket the history part of this.
Okay. That's good. Big if true. But I mean, this is where, when Matthew is starting out, right, and saying, like, this is the story I'm telling you, and then he launches into a genealogy, and it's like, I mean, it goes all the way back to Abraham, right? And this is this is it's a boring way to start a story, right? And so I whenever I'm teaching Matthew in class, I always show up and I ask students, raise your hand if you skipped when you were reading. You were reading the first few chapters of Matthew. Raise your hand if you skipped the genealogy. And they all really look around, like, uneasily, right? Because they're like, well, I don't know, like, and then slowly, like, the hands start going up. Like, I skipped it. So why did you skip it? And like, well, it's just a big list of names, right? It is a big list of names. And so I always tell them, like, I don't blame you actually for skipping that, in the same way that people skip reading block quotations, right? Nobody reads them. So just kind of skims over. I assume this is good. But this is where Matthew is, I think, starting to make that case for that identity of Jesus. And he's not subtle really about any of this stuff. And so I talk in the book about the numerical significance of the genealogy, the division into 14 generations, and all of this is pointing to David, who is in the genealogy. He's the 14th character in the genealogy. Like, there's nothing subtle about what Matthew is doing. He's telling you this is all about David. And then he sort of reminds you, like, just a reminder, this is all about David. And then also, where's Jesus born? In Bethlehem, the city of David, right? It's like, thanks, we got it, right? Yeah. So not a very subtle author, but I think that the Magi story is kind of in that same level of not being terribly subtle, at least for the first century reader. I think they're looking at that and going, oh yeah, this is sort of part of that. They are legitimizing his kingship.
Mm-hmm. And so when say more about that, because what do you think what do we know about kind of the original audience and kind of cultural moment, Second Temple period Judaism, Roman Empire and such? What role do characters like the Magi from the East and such play in other contemporary stories?
Yeah. So let me start with the question of what do we know about the audience of Matthew? I mean, that's one of those questions that's really, really going to depend on who you ask. Is like, who is this audience? Who is Matthew writing for? Is he writing for anyone in particular? That is an ongoing, lively question in biblical studies. But I think what we do know about Matthew is that Matthew is writing during a period of the first century where the maybe early Christians' attitudes toward Rome have started to sour a bit, and not least because the Romans have destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. And the 60s also brought the reign of Nero, which was not friendly to Christians in Rome. And so I think that Matthew is very much writing in that context of like, maybe Rome isn't our friend, right? Or at least perhaps. And I think that his kind of commentary on Jesus's kingship and the legitimacy of Jesus being the king of the Judeans is sort of meant to be throwing a bit of shade at Herod, at Herod the Great. And the reason I say that is, Herod the Great, his formal title is the king of the Judeans. That is the title that he has. It's his official, on his door, right? That's the brass plate. Herod the Great, king of the Judeans. But we know from other first century non-biblical literature, Josephus, to be specific, says that Herod got that title from the Roman Senate. They are the ones who said, yeah, you're going to be the king of the Judeans. You're in charge of this area. And so, but also the kind of interesting thing about Herod is that Herod isn't even a Judean. Herod is an Idumean, and just like his father before him. And so I think Matthew is sort of maybe in some ways pointing to the mess and the kind of meddling that he sees as Rome having done, and maybe trying to send that. I don't know if that's his main message, but he's certainly operating in that kind of, Rome is not friendly to what I'm talking about here. And I think you see that also in, not only does Herod, the puppet king of the Romans, try to kill Jesus, the king of the Judeans, but then at the end of Matthew's gospel, the Romans do kill Jesus, and they put the sign above his head, the king of the Judeans.
Yeah. Yeah. Which is, connecting those two dots, both about, Jesus's vocation, right? From, in some sense, in the Gospel of Matthew, is this ultimate affront from Mount of Transfiguration down, going to Jerusalem, facing the opponents, and that kind of stuff. But the other side of that, I've been thinking about this year when rereading the Matthew text, is that they put King of the Jews over Jesus text in over the cross. Also lets you know just how just how cooperative Herod has to be with Rome, right? Like, this is what happens if you don't do what we want, right? Like, we have no problem replacing you and no problem killing you. And I think that that kind of known, I mean, Herod, not a quality guy, killed lots of people that he even suspected of getting in the way. Didn't do a very good job as a parent. His children and such didn't do a very good job. But the thing that strikes me about the wise men, Magi, in this story is the way in which they're like, why even go? If you're following a star, right? I assume a star can be a little more direct. Why go to Jerusalem and go to the castle to ask a question to only find out this isn't even the right town? Right? Like, it's like the star was like a generic GPS. It got to the 4 or 5 zip codes nearby and then pieced out. So if you're not asking the history questions, but you're thinking of the text questions, why did Matthew have the Magi go and interact with Herod to begin with? Right? Like, that to me isn't necessary unless you're trying to do something with it, as a story.
Well, and I think that's a great observation. And one of the things that I've realized the more time that I've spent, I've spent a lot of time with this story, obviously, and just reading and rereading it. Yeah,
What'd you do? Write a book about it?
Well, I mean, eventually, yes, but no, reading and rereading it, and and seeing new things every time that happens. A couple of years ago, I changed the way that I understood what the star is doing in this story. So I was very much there's a very common kind of trope in biblical scholarship among people who are writing about this story, and the trope is, the star is not a normal star because the star leads the Magi to Jerusalem, but then it makes it takes a left-hand turn, right? You might have heard this before, right? Normal stars don't turn. They just kind of go straight, or they hang, or whatever. But this star seems very unusual because it leads them from the east to Jerusalem, and then Bethlehem is south of Jerusalem. And so then it leads them sort of whatever. But what I finally realized when I was reading this story once was, in the first part of the story, the star does not lead the Magi to Jerusalem. The star sends the Magi to Jerusalem. And the difference being, when we think about the star in the traditional kind of way of thinking about the Christmas story, is we think about this almost like a homing beacon, right? Like, just kind of they are like trying to catch up with it and whatever. And in later stories, it certainly does become that. But in Matthew's story, what they always talk about it in the past, right? They say, when they get to Jerusalem, they say, "Where's the one born king of the Judeans? We saw his star at its rising. We saw his star in the east." And so what Matthew, I think, is doing here is that these characters have seen some sort of astronomical event, be it a star or whatever it is, and they have discerned the significance that they discern from that is the one born king of the Judeans has been born, right? The king of the Judeans has been born.
So it wasn't a traveling dot. It was their stargazing with their stargazing maps and their kind of cultivated hermeneutics of reading the stars, and like, oh, hey, King of Judean star just rocked it. Right, we got a new one on the march. Let's go say hi.
Yeah, the one born king of the Judeans. There's his star.
So obviously, you go to where the royalty is.
There you go. Jerusalem. Right, you go to Jerusalem. So just like if I'm sitting out, looking at the stars or whatever, and I look up and I say, "Oh, that star says, I should go see the president of the United States."
Yeah, something's probably in retrograde.
Right. Well, where do I go? Right. I know where the president lives, so I'm going to start by going there, right? And but the interesting thing is, though, that once they reach Jerusalem and they say, "We're looking for the one born king of the Judeans," and Herod says, well, And
Where's my
he has,
Bible experts?
yeah, he gets his advisors. He's like, where is this person, right? Because he's sort of acknowledging in Matthew's story that it's not him, right? He's like, well, I'm not the one born king of the Judeans. I got my title from Rome.
Yeah, he's very understanding about the way that power dynamic works.
Right. But but then in the second part of the story, when they leave Jerusalem, that's when the star reappears, and then it does almost become almost like a homing beacon, right? So they follow it to Bethlehem, and then it stops directly over Jesus's head, right? And so it really is the case, I think, that we have two different types of star stories in Matthew.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So, okay. So that's fascinating. So like, if you dug into that, let's say if someone invites me to preach Epiphany this year,
Mm.
how fascinating is it that you go to the imperial cooperative fake king of Judea, and you ask like who's born a king? He's obviously ready to kill somebody, and needs to know where it is, so he has to go check the text, and the texts actually point to somewhere else, right? So
Right.
that though, like in order to find the true king, you aren't going to Rome and you aren't going to Jerusalem, and you're going to have to check the text of the oppressed people who had hope of attending elsewhere, right? The town of the youngest son. And anyway, like underneath that, it's like re-amplifying, right? That larger political thread that's sitting there in Matthew, that the wise men then have to go learn something that even the so-called king of Judea needed to learn, that the source of God's salvation doesn't come from the center of power, but from the
Absolutely.
outskirts.
Yeah, it comes from the margins, right? And it comes from the place that you don't really expect it. And that's, I mean, the same thing, the same kind of story if we're following the David trail, back with the story of the anointing of David, right? And
Yeah.
so when the prophet goes and God says, "I'll show you which of Jesse's sons," and they all start coming in.
Yeah, try them on.
He's like, "Oh wow, that's a beautiful one." It's like, "No, not that one." Yeah, that's another beautiful one. No, not that one. It's like,
Chiseled jaw.
yeah,
Look at that.
right? Do you have any other sons? Like, well, there's the little runt who's in the field, and so go get him. And then that ends up being right. That sort of surprising, the surprising person ends up being the person. Yeah,
Yeah. Oh, all right. That's fun. That's okay. So,
I hope you're writing all this down just in case. I mean, you do have the
I'm
book as well.
actually recording
So,
it as well. Did you know that, Eric?
shoot, that's
That's
what that. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
To
See,
watch what I say.
now people are, if they aren't watching the video, are like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Were they wearing something inappropriate? Are they getting dressed again? Like what? Now Eric freaked out once he heard recording. What's going on?
No, I keep.
You don't know
Yeah.
what Bible nerds do when they're just on Zoom talking. You know.
I mean, I do, because we're currently on, Bible Nerds on Zoom talking. So I
No,
assume they do something like this.
I was luring them over to the
Okay.
video
Yeah.
where they too can see a cover of your book right there,
Yes.
right
Yes.
there.
Yes.
Yeah.
Almost like a star sort of drawing them in.
Oh yeah.
Yes.
Like in general, you're like, look,
Mhm.
it's Epiphany Sunday coming up. I love the Magi. But then do you want to get specific direction towards a sermon that will rock the pulpit? Whoa, that is the noise of your book flying by.
There you go.
Specific direction. Go to the blog
Yes.
post, click that link. And look, you don't have to read it. You could just purchase copies for your 10 closest friends and repeat your favorite parts of things Eric say on the podcast. He's open to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I've heard, I don't know if
You've
this
heard.
is actually confirmed yet, but
Okay.
I've heard that these books actually make very good stocking stuffers.
Ooh, yeah. You have to have the right size stocking.
Yeah.
But every good nerd knows you do not have a stocking too small for books. Otherwise, you know what you get? Socks. You get socks and underwear. That's what parents get if they don't have a stocking big enough for books.
Yeah.
And yeah. Anyway, the now you mentioned in the introduction that the origin for this comes out of your dissertation work, which wasn't just the canonical text, but all the apocryphal kind of non-canonical text in the early church period. So when you think of that kind of ongoing fascination with the Magi, how do they show up in the you talk about different letters and sermons, hymns and such in the first couple hundred years of church history?
Well, so and I'm an apocrypha scholar by training, and so that's sort of my that's one of my loves. And yeah, one of the ways that I approach apocrypha, non-canonical gospels, is to ask the question of how they are taking stories from the New Testament and retelling those stories. And so to look at the types of details that they're changing, the types of details that they're adding, the things that they're taking away, and so how, just like when we tell stories, we change details, right? So there's a great example of this is the story of the three little pigs, right? It's a story that exists in a number of different forms, one of which being and this is the one that most people, I think, probably don't grow up um, reading or hearing, is like the wolf, eats the first two pigs, right? The pig that had his house made out of straw, he doesn't run and have shelter in his brother's house. He gets eaten, because that's what happens when you build a house out of straw. Same thing happens with the house made out of sticks. And then when the wolf finally comes down the chimney of the third little pig, then the wolf lands in a cauldron of boiling broth or whatever, and this third little pig cooks him. And it's pretty barbaric, right? It's not only is he eating, it's almost like that the phenomenon of the turducken. You've ever heard of these things before, right?
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. And have you
Yeah.
ever had a fried turducken?
I have
That's how you
not.
level it up in the South. See, that's
Yeah.
what you're in just in Virginia. You gotta
Yeah.
go a little further south.
Yeah.
Turducken, deep
Okay.
fried.
I saw the other day also a meme that was a turkey stuffed with like a squid or something. They called it a turkraken or something like that. Really, just a very rare delicacy. But anyway,
Yeah.
but that's a wolf though who has eaten two pigs, who is then being cooked into a soup. I mean, I don't know what that soup tastes like. Do I want to know? Not really. But that's how one version of that story goes. When I'm telling my kids that story, if I decide to tell them that story, that's not the version I'm telling them. Even though I think that's probably the more interesting version, the version that I'm telling them is like, oh, the two little pigs, they made it to their brother's house, and then they were safe behind the bricks, and then the wolf came down the chimney, he burned his butt, and then shot up, and then like a Looney Tunes character sort of ran away on fire. Like that's the story I'm telling them, because I don't like telling those stories where people like are or pigs are dying, and or like when you've got a like the older brother who is eating the creature that ate his two other brothers. Like that's
Yeah.
a pretty dark story, right? Anyway, so so this is how apocrypha works though, right? Is that you have these authors who, let's tell the story of the Magi, but let's change some details here and there. And so you have an early example of this is the text that I wrote my dissertation on, the Proto-Gospel of James, where the author changes, one of the big details that he changes is the brightness of the star, right? The Magi say, we saw the star and it was so bright, and all the other stars were dimmed. It was so bright. Well, why does the author change that story? Well, probably, if you imagine somebody sitting there reading Matthew to their kids, is that happening? No, but let's just imagine that it is. And then they say, we saw the star at its rising. And then the kid says, Daddy, why was that star different? I don't know. Maybe it was a different color, or maybe it was brighter than all the other ones, right? And so that's the kind of impulse that goes into apocrypha, is emphasizing these details in different ways. But all sorts of really wild stuff happens with the Apocrypha as well. And not only with the Magi, but a lot of it with the star. There's a great text called the Revelation of the Magi. It was written in Syriac. And in this
Around what
text,
time?
that is a really, really good question. I think those guesses range from like 5th century to 8th century or so. I might be a little bit early on the latter end of that, but yeah, so somewhere in that kind of period. It's a bit later. But in that text, the star is Jesus himself, who's like a shapeshifter, right? And so he shows up in this land of the Magi, and he says, follow me. I'm going to be born in Bethlehem or whatever.
And bring me cool gifts.
Bring me cool gifts. And luckily they actually live in this place where there's like a cave called the Cave of Treasures that is filled with all these kind of cool gifts. And so they take presents from there, whatever. And then they follow the star, or they follow Jesus, right? Who is the star. And yeah, it's just wild. These retellings.
And I think one of the things that the retellings through the history of the church help show us is how different what different ways people engage these stories through the history of the church. There's so many people today are shaped by that kind of initial Protestant impulse, and then have they get lusty after scientific notions of truth.
Right.
So that then we relate to any text that's supposed to have some authority or claim on us, like they're relating to an electron or something. And when you start to say, oh, no, look at all the different ways this story shows up through the life, the history of Christ's body, then you realize there are different relationships with the very same text that we've all go, okay, we trust these. And I just think that's an important gift, because there are more and more people running to dead ends if the kind of Enlightenment framed version of Protestant biblicism dominates.
That's absolutely right. And I think, I will, it is like you say, it's a gift when you go and you read these texts and you look at what they're doing. And I think, apocryphal texts, if you're dealing with somebody who's, let's say, a biblicist, apocryphal texts can be dismissed pretty easily, because a biblicist will just say, well, that's not in the Bible, so I don't really care. And it's not in the Bible because they're heretics or something like that. Obviously that's not my view. I think that these are very, very helpful windows into early Christianity, and to see how early Christians are dealing with text and relating to text. But one of the things that you see when you immerse yourself in this ancient literature is that you see just how absent that sort of biblicism is, right? All these details must be, true and accurate, and it's a static text and all of that. I mean, you just don't find that. You don't find that in Apocrypha. You don't find that in patristics. These earliest interpreters of the Gospels, they are playfully creative with what they find there, and they don't have that same kind of concern that many modern Christians do.
Yeah. And one of the other, I guess, ways the text is playful is also in relationship to other texts that are running around.
Right.
Could you say something about like the Julian Star and how that kind of gives a different way of even imagining how kind of this inheritance of star imagery in Hebrew scripture connects with the kind of political imagery in the present? Well,
Yeah.
Matthew's present.
Sure, right. Now, the Julian Star is a really, really well-known tale, and the Julian Star is the star that shows up the summer after the assassination of Julius Caesar in Rome by the Senate. And the Julian Star is likely a comet of some sort, and it's a very, very bright comet. But it is, we have Roman sources that talk about it, and we have fascinating piece of my research. We even have Chinese sources that talk about this event. So we're fairly certain that there was something that showed up in the summer of in that summer. But the Julian Star was interpreted by many in Rome as a sign that Julius Caesar had been deified after his death, that he had ascended to the heavens, and that he was now seated among the gods of the Roman pantheon. And so, but the Julian Star then also is situated in that broader discursive reservoir of the ancient world, where people talk about stars rising and stars falling as evidence that, this ruler has risen and then this ruler has fallen. Great example, of course, being the often misinterpreted passage in Isaiah, where Isaiah is talking about, oh, how fallen are you, day star, the son of the morning. You said I will hoist myself up into the heavens and whatever, but now you're fallen. And thanks to Milton, everyone assumes that this is a story of the fall of Lucifer, Satan, or whatever.
Yes,
But
Satan.
right. Well, I mean, but see, here's a spoiler though, Trip. That passage actually says that it's about the king of Babylon, right?
Who works for who?
Well, right. That's you know that.
Satan.
Yeah.
He works for Satan.
Oh,
That's right. That was the Whore of Babylon
yeah.
soundtrack.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
Right there. Get
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Throwing that
I do.
Isaiah into Revelation callback.
Okay.
But we could have just done Satan, right?
Yeah.
Like, who's he work for? Satan. Like that.
Yeah.
Those are my buttons.
You
really appreciated the first one, so now there's a high likelihood I might push them.
I like it. And the thing that's great about those sound effects is that they're really hard to come back from and like argue against, right? Because I feel like, I mean, at this point, nothing I say is because I don't have those, right? And so
I can hit one for you though.
So well, maybe you can choose one, but no, I think that's I did once hear somebody say something like that when I was talking about the take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, right? And it's like, well, so he's talking to the king of Babylon, and then I think it was a student who was like, well, who's the real king of Babylon?
Ooh,
Satan, right?
Real king.
Yeah. And so and like, well, how do you like? So that's a sort of nonsense, right? Though it's a nonsense. How do you respond to nonsense? I just said, well, it's like, okay. But I mean, at its face value, this is a text that is talking about the king of Babylon, right?
Right.
And so, but anyway, no, but I think that the Julian Star, or the Star of Caesar, whatever you want to call it, is very much in that same kind of orbit of, you've got all these stories in the Hebrew Bible about stars rising and falling. There's one in Numbers that's associated with the prophet Balaam, who's most famous for his talking donkey. But there's also, you see it in Roman literature about this star. You see it in, in Revelation, and you see it also in Matthew. The new star on the horizon means whoever is currently in power isn't going to be anymore. Yeah. So.
Yeah. I just think it's one of those, like, when you put the star in Matthew's narrative in its historical context, then these seeming, I see what y'all are doing. Is you trying to make this political? Then the more and more these layers show up, you go, oh no, this is actually how you talk about these things in this historical moment.
Right.
And
yeah. And
okay. Oh, go ahead. No, this is a complete change of direction, but I had never read the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy, and that's high quality material. And if you were thinking through the story of like retelling the stories to kids and where this one comes from, I'm guessing 7-year-old, 6-year-old boy who wants to have battles all the time because you get the Magi level up here.
Yeah. And when you started out by saying I had never read the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy before,
you're sad.
Well, no, I was going to say you might be surprised at how often I hear that.
I'm sitting there going, I'm like, I'm bound to have something with this in it, but I couldn't find anything.
No, and you won't find it anywhere. I mean, there's but it's not like when I go and talk about this, the people are like, oh yeah, the AGO. I've got that on my bedside table. It's been there for forever.
Keep it on the Kindle just in case.
Yeah, I've got it. I got a copy in my backpack. I've got it on audiobook or whatever. No, I mean, I just don't really get that a lot from people. And, part of it, if you're somebody who has, collections of apocryphal literature, the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy, if it's in there at all, it's in there just as a summary of the contents, because the text itself there's really just not a whole lot of good English translations of it. And the one that exists that's accessible, the hard copy is really expensive. And so, anyway, but the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy is a trip. And I keep using that word, a trip, as an homage, of course, to you for hosting me. I hope you like it. But no, it's really, really fascinating because, one of the strange things about Matthew's story, right, is that when the Magi show up to Jerusalem, Herod is panicked, or he's terrified, and the whole city is panicked and terrified with him. And, if we're reading this story as a kind of, a political treatise of some sort on the illegitimacy of Herod's kingship, well, if the Magi are understood in that sense of like, when these guys show up, there's about to be a change in power, right? Well, then then they're right to be terrified. But the text, like the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy, is also asking that question of like, why are these people panicked? Well, and in the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy, it's because the Magi have shown up with literal armies, right? Like thousands and thousands of troops, and they get to Jerusalem, and then they, the star kind of disappears, and then they camp out around the city. So it's like, what's happening in the Armenian Gospel of the Infancy is foreign armies have just shown up and laid siege to the city.
I know. I mean,
right.
that's
wild.
what I'm saying. It's a parent with like a kid that is like, no, tell me the one with the soldiers in it. And they're like,
right.
oh, you mean, so there were these wise guys? Now, you know how wise they were? Military leaders.
Right.
Daddy, how many soldiers did they have? Thousands.
Yeah.
Thousands.
It's like a scene out of Lord of the Rings, right?
Yeah. Helm's Deep.
Right,
they're
exactly. They're like, here come the Magi.
Look to the dawning on the third day, says Gandalf. And then who comes? Yes. Not the riders of Rohan. No. Magi war machine. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, it's intense. And I remember the first time reading that going, I mean, I don't really know if there's any other instance of that in, that I've seen, right, with these like literal thousands of soldiers, right, armies and armies. But also sort of this is part of the transformation of the Magi from, priestly figures or advisory figures or, the kind of generic wise men, the transformation of these characters into kings and into people who are themselves powerful. And so, kings travel with troops, and they don't travel alone. And maybe that even adds to the political dimensions of this story, right? These kings are coming to subject themselves to the king of the Judeans in kind of later interpretations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh no, I'm just, at some point, someone should make cartoons of all the different apocryphal gospels, so we get so people can see them. Because that would be fun. Where like this normal story, but have you heard this one? And right. Each variation of the different stories, you get like a different graphic style. So like all of a sudden, this one gets into like really like gothic imagery and junk, and they get swords just flying around. You know, if you throw that on Disney Plus. Had a collection of all the apocryphal stories. Oh yeah, you have one with the Magi rocking soldiers. Come on, kids are gonna be like they'll never want to read the Bible that much. It's like my son wanted to hear the story of Deborah for years, just over and over, because she takes charge and goes to kick some butt, or how like Joshua got the choir to sneak in at night around the bad guy's army and start singing, and they get up and just take each other out. I'm like, do you want to read the Sermon on the Mount? No, what about when the bad guys kill the bad guys? All right.
Right. Well, and like if you've ever led a youth group Bible study before, and you ask them like, and obviously this is autobiographical. The first time I did such a thing, I said, what do you all want to study? Well, what was the answer? Revelation, right? I mean, like, let's read the one about the blood. And
we know there's a lot of violence and sex. Can we go to those?
Yeah, let's do that. Now, as you're talking about this, I mean, this is I know we're recording, but this is a really valuable idea that I don't think you should give away quite as easily as you are right now, right?
Well,
because I mean, you think about like something about like the revelation of the Magi, right? Where the Magi are coming from this mystical land, and then they have you remember when I talked about the food that they're eating along the way, and the star, the light of the star is multiplying the food. And then when they get back to the land and all the people are like, tell us about what you saw. And they're like, why don't you have some of this food? And then the people eat the food and they start seeing visions.
Yeah.
And so you have like, all the
psychedelic magi.
Yeah. I mean, this is basically a story about hallucinogenics. And so, I mean, it's not the only thing it's about, but it's certainly a subplot. And so, having like,
but for cable, you could make it a central theme.
I'm thinking, yeah, like Leaving Las Vegas or whatever that, that really trippy, that's the kind of, yeah. No, let's I'll have my people get in touch with your people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
by the time the editors get done, it's like the Magi in Hot Tub Time Machine 3,
Mm,
and
mm,
so no, this is a key change just because I want to talk about the patristic things, and there is a passage where and you do this throughout the book where you tell us your questions, and I think it's really helpful for people to hear the kind of questions someone's surveying, all the different ways the Magi show up in the different kind of early church thinkers.
mm,
So you ask, one of the most important things we can learn from this body of literature is how patristic authors were reading and interpreting texts like Matthew.
mhm,
What details stood out to them? What questions did they have? How did they construct meaning from the stories that they read? These are the sorts of questions that were asked of the apocryphal texts, but unlike those texts whose narrative retellings of the Magi are often not explicit of what they were trying to do, the patristic authors generally write with the goal of conveying their thoughts to readers in a more direct way.
mhm,
So, like when you start to think of those questions, they're different than, say, the ones I use when I teach historical theology,
mhm.
of looking at the patristics. And I don't think any of the things you talk about I've ever mentioned when introducing early church fathers. It's always like the stuff that led up to
Mhm.
councils,
Right,
that kind of thing.
right. Yeah. Well, and a funny thing, so my oldest daughter is currently reading this book, which is kind of fun. She's 11, which is fun, but she's just
Oh yeah.
started the chapter on the patristics, and she asked me the other day when we were in the car about the parasitic authors. And
Ooh.
I know, and I was like, and that, I mean, that's an autocorrect that's happened on my phone a couple times, because normal people,
Don't
and
text that.
well, I was going to say they do, right? I mean, this is something that normal people talk about as patristic authors in their text messages. But apparently, I
Yeah.
don't talk enough about patristic authors in my text messages because my phone was like, "Do you mean parasitic authors?" Like, well, some of them perhaps. Um,
My autocorrect changes pretend to prehend, which just means that you wrote about Alfred North Whitehead because he
wow,
made the word up.
yeah,
And
huh. Wow, that's wild. Yeah. The algorithms that really govern our lives and are now like becoming part of our consciousnesses, they're just fascinating things.
yeah, it makes
But
you real optimistic.
yeah, it does. It does. Welcome to the future, I guess. But no, I think, I with patristic authors, I do think when I think about the difference between apocrypha and patristic authors, there's certainly some patristic texts, even the ones discussed in this book, that are anonymous. And so a lot of people say, like, one of the things that characterizes apocryphal texts is that they are pseudonymous, often, right, written under the name of somebody who didn't actually write the text, right? So like the Proto-Gospel of James claims to be written by the older half or step sibling of Jesus, where in fact it was written by an anonymous person who really wanted people to take him seriously, and so he put that name on there. But patristic texts sometimes are also anonymous as well. But I think about them as texts with thesis statements, if that makes sense. So like, John Chrysostom isn't like, I want to inspire the imagination of my readers and get them to come to their own conclusions about these texts. Like, no, that's not Chrysostom's goal. Chrysostom's goal is like, I'm going to tell you what to think. Um, maybe not in all places, but in the text that I'm looking at, he's like, no,
Yeah, I
I'm going
mean,
to
he
tell
is a
you. Yeah,
saint, Eric. He's a saint. He's
it's
got
true.
it's his first name, Saint John Chrysostom.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's another one of those like nonsense claims. I can't really argue with that. And Chrysostom actually is a fun little story. There's a nickname that was given to him posthumously, so he would have never introduced himself as Saint John Chrysostom. Maybe Saint John, right? But definitely not Chrysostom. The Golden Mouthed is his name. So
Ooh,
yeah,
the
I know.
golden mouthed.
I know. It's like a James Bond movie, right? Psychedelics. So
Watch out! You've already
I
brought
know.
up the mushrooms with the Magi.
I know. There's a thread. But no, I think I think probably those questions that I'm asking that you said you don't really think about too much. I think those questions are probably coming from my own focus in my research on literature and on stories. And so, I am kind of in that chapter working with the way that these authors are reimagining Matthew's story, or reimagining whatever version of the story that they have access to. Like Justin Martyr is telling the story of the Magi, but is he telling it through Matthew, or is he telling it through the Diatessaron or whatever text he's working with, or is he working with just a story that he heard once? But yeah, the different ways that they think about these characters and their significance for Matthew, and the patristic authors often frame the Magi as in need of some sort of conversion, or in need of some sort of like spiritual liberation. And so they are either like sorcerer figures who are, shackled to the forces of evil, or they're just stupid Gentiles
Yeah.
who don't really know what they need. They're just following the star. They end up being, better for it in the end. But that's the patristic authors sort of use that story as a way of talking about the need for conversion.
And do you think there's a contrast, in part because the story in some sense is just one of the received stories, and so the kind of political questions, say, that are going on in Matthew, the kind of the way he's picking up these themes through the Hebrew scriptures, but also it's composing a theological birth narrative when the church is still trying to figure out its own identity, its relationship to the risen Christ, how that connects to the God of Israel, and all the you're at a different kind of period. And I wonder what parts of those live questions, say, in when Matthew came into being, have been kind of set aside, and what are the different questions at the center of the early church that this text in particular becomes a place to ask them.
Right. Well, and I do think that, taking a piece of what you just said, I do think that there's also a shift that happens once you start getting, once Christianity becomes more and more prominent, and then especially once it becomes kind of yoked with, um, with political power, right? When it becomes sort of Christendom, then the types of questions that these authors are asking really does shift very much, right? It's no longer a political, theological, or theopolitical, I guess, tale about, you'll find the king in an unexpected place, because all of a sudden it's like, no, we are the king now.
Yeah.
And that introduces a whole different dynamic, I think. Yeah.
Do you see the kind of theological questions that the patristics, if you think of and why I mentioned teaching the historical theology class, right? The elements of the patristics are so that you pull out, or kind of to show the way the Christological controversies develop, and then you're reading it and say, how does that logic connect with contemporary philosophy at the time, and how does that ultimately set up for thinking about the Trinity in the next set of councils and such? Do the birth narratives, what kind of role do they play in the church's kind of ongoing reflection about how God and Jesus are related?
Well, in the, I think in the patristic era, I think that one of the things that you have is an interpretation of the Magi story as, how do I say this? An interpretation of the Magi story as signaling Jesus's divinity, right? So, and I think, one of the big things that contributes to that is that what the word that Matthew uses, where they say, when they come to Jerusalem, they say, "Where's the one born King of the Judeans?" We've come to proskuneo, is the Greek verb, which sometimes is translated as worship, and sometimes is translated as bow before. And so, my read of this story in Matthew is that the Magi are, again, they're there to legitimize and put their stamp on the legitimacy of Jesus's kingship. And so when they are asking, where is this one born king of the Judeans, they're not looking for they're not looking for God in human form in Matthew, at least not according to my reading. They are looking for a king. They're bringing the king expensive gifts, and they want to bow before the king, which is what you do when you pay tribute to a new king. But then the patristic authors, I think, they sort of see this as, they're looking at that bowing and saying, well, they're interpreting that either as they're worshiping Jesus, or they can almost say, you can almost say that there's sort of an irony there, right? Like they came to just bow before Jesus as a king, but in reality, they were actually worshiping the God of Israel or something like that. And so I do think that the patristic uses of this story probably evidence that connection between, Jesus, that kind of Christological question of like, what is Jesus? Is he just a human, or is he God as well? And I think there's definitely that.
And I think that's important to point out because, a lot of times, especially today, there are so many different expressions of any religious tradition, and in the West, so many different versions of Christianity. The likelihood that you go to read the text and have learned to not notice that you were already taught how to interpret the story is high, right? So the Cappadocians read the Magi and are like, well, obviously, what you're recognizing is ultimately Johannine Christology right here in the birth story, and in this kind of thing. So it's when we start just following this one story and seeing how all the different places in culture, the text is never read raw. It's never given full. And its meaning it has a surplus to it, where the kinds of questions and assumptions given readers and communities have find it as a place to either project or to be disturbed. And I think that is it's like less threatening, right, to point that out if you're tracing how it happens through history, rather than like second chapter. Did you know that the there is a Herod today, and it is insert whatever your political intuitions
whoever you don't
are.
like.
And also they killed Jesus, and you don't want and all those kinds of all that kind of process. The in the last two chapters, you deal with the ways this story gets picked up in much more contemporary context. Gotta love, shout out to the Lamb, high quality modern fiction. If you never read the Gospel According to Biff, but what was it like when you're switching, as someone who spent time doing New Testament scholarship and thinking about biblical studies, how it relates to the history of Israel, how the early church wrestles with it, and doing the apocrypha that you've spent time on? What happens when you make that key shift to, well, now that everyone's in Christendom, you would have to put your head in the ground not to know who the Magi are. So then what happens with it? What's that like as a scholar doing that shift to them as cultural icons of sorts?
Right. Yeah. The chapter, that very last chapter that you're talking about, was really in many ways one of my favorite ones to work on. It was unsettling in a few ways, just because some of the more harmful Magi kind of interpretations are pretty conspicuous in the more recent literature, especially some of the anti-Jewish interpretations. But no, I mean, it really, you're right. If you've got a scene where you have a star and the dudes on camels, right? Even though there's no camels in Matthew, whatever. But you don't have to have grown up going to church to drive by and be like, if somebody says, "What are those?" Nobody's going to be like, "I'm not really sure," or very few people, right? So it's sort of, they're very, very ingrained in the culture. That's why, they can show up in Monty Python, right? In Life of Brian, right? That's sort of they're just there, and they don't really have to have any explanation. You just, right when the screen comes on and they're there, that's who they are, right? But no, I mean, it was an interesting shift just to look at, two of the stories that I examined in that last chapter with Lamb, and then the Barbara Brown Taylor children's book. Those are written by authors who are living, right? And so that's, I think, as a scholar of ancient literature, one of the biggest shifts is, and it's also kind of daunting, to write about things that the people who created them are still alive. And so, this kind of daunting, like, have I gotten this correct? Like, I don't know. I didn't email Moore and say, can you read this and make sure that I'm good to go? Because really, if my project is legitimate, it doesn't matter really what his intention was. I have the text that I have. Same thing is true with the Taylor book. Did you mean to be anti-Jewish on this 2-page spread here? I'm guessing her answer is going to be no. And I'm inclined to believe her. But the tropes that were constructed in that early period, those are sort of part of that pop culture. Those are sort of, well, I wouldn't say pop culture, but those are part of the Magi. Keep wanting to call it an icon, right? But that sort of package of, like, the story of the wise men. What is it about? And that comes packaged with a whole bunch of presumptions that now are just part of the story, but then when you go back and reread it, are not really there.
Yeah. In what do you think happens as a function more and more detached from Matthew, right? So people recognize them, but they recognize them probably because they were in a nativity or watched Christmas movies that had a nativity,
right,
or that kind of thing. Even Charlie Brown really only reads Luke,
right.
and so the Magi, in some sense, that, like, people will immediately recognize them, and what makes them recognize them may not even be in Matthew, say camels, or there's 3, and that
Or
kind
they're
of thing.
dressed, or I mean, I took my kids to an Advent play the other day, and you had all of these people dressed in, shabby, Bedouin style
Oh
robes or
yeah.
whatever. And then the Magi show up and they've got these huge mushroom hats and, like, the jewels and all of the ornate whatever. And it's like, oh man, I mean, and they are dressed completely uniquely. Well, why? Well, because they're from the East, and also they bring fancy gifts, therefore they must be wealthy.
Mention, taking your kids and seeing the Advent play and such, and I think part of what I was getting at, before I interrupted you, was asking how you see the Magi functioning now that they're even more detached from the Gospel of Matthew's own text than, I mean, when the early church fathers are wrestling with it, the function of the text is a lot stronger. It's set in a religious context.
Right.
It eventually is part of canon, these kind of things. Now the cultural nativity story plays a dominating form. What are the new challenges that takes for those who want to wrestle with, in many ways, the biblical challenge Matthew is presenting in the story of the Magi?
Yeah. Well, and I think, that's a really good question. I think that, when you're dealing with this sort of story as packaged in the nativities and then the Epiphany sermons, or God forbid, the actual Christmas Day sermons, like keep the Magi in Epiphany. That doesn't really make any sense, but we'll go with it. I think that the kind of common understanding, or one of the common understandings of that story, what are the Magi doing there? Well, the Magi are, people who are coming to Jesus to worship Jesus just like us, or something like that, right? This idea of, I don't know how many times I've heard this idea of, like, just like the wise men, we too are on a journey pilgrimaging towards the manger or something, which is kind of a funny, mix of stories, because there's no major in Matthew. But but this idea of, though, that we are the Magi, we are the ones who are making our way towards towards Jesus. And I think that in terms of like the theological uses of a story, if you've got somebody who's preaching a sermon and wants to meet his or her audience, or whatever, what do we call these things? Congregations, right? They want to meet their congregation where they are. And I mean, personally, I think that rediscovering Matthew's political dimensions of this story can be very, very sharp and valuable, especially in our current situation. But if you have somebody who is sort of a recipient of that predominant story of who were the Magi, what were they doing, or whatever, which is that they were sort of Gentiles coming to worship Jesus, I think that's a perfectly understandable thing to emphasize, right? Is sort of, talking to people and say, we're in the season where we are kind of sort of journeying along with these people towards the object of our faith, or something like that. But it does present a challenge, though, when somebody like me says, okay, let's dial it back and let's see, let's take away all those layers and see what's actually going on in the story. Are the Magi actually seeking an encounter with God in human form? The patristic authors say, yeah or no, but that's still what they get. But I'm not sure that that's Matthew's point. Does Matthew think that Jesus is God in human form? Yeah, probably. But that's not the point of the Magi story, right? Yeah.
Yeah. I kept thinking when reading it of some of the worst Christmas pageants that have existed. And in particular, I don't know why, this wasn't included maybe in the next edition, but I was a part of a Christmas pageant where I played one of the camels. And because this pageant obviously focused on the animals, and the camels rap, not WRAP, the gifts, but they were rapping camels.
Yeah.
And I just thought, Matthew could not have anticipated the aesthetic heights that this narrative would generate, that a couple thousand years later, my hot jams would be associated with the Magi.
Yeah. I often think about, that question of if we had some of these ancient authors or Jesus himself and said, what do you think about this? I just imagine them saying, like, that I can't even imagine that Matthew could compute a rapping camel.
Well, well, I mean, you haven't heard me spit rhymes yet, Eric.
It's true. Spit.
So
camels,
how has your kind of journey from Welch's style Methodism into kind of academic relationship to the text changed the way you kind of wrestle and ask life's biggest questions?
Oof, that's another softball, huh?
Yeah.
I think, I think for me, there's been a fair deal. I think that the academic approach to the biblical texts and to other ancient literature has been very freeing in many ways. And I think that, it's sort of, I think it certainly has complexified, complexified my relationship with those texts, right? Sort of as a kind of vanilla centrist Methodist growing up, I didn't really think much about these questions of what did Matthew intend. I mean, as silly as it sounds, I still remember in that first New Testament class that I took, where I was going to own my professor for, not having read First Timothy before he says whether Paul wrote it. One of the biggest, like, eye-opening moments for me in that class was even the notion that these texts had authors, if that makes sense. Because I feel like one of the things that many people who are raised, in kind of religious settings where they're dealing with these texts or reading these texts or hearing about these texts, is that the author is sort of left out of the equation, right? We just obviously now for when we're sitting here talking, that sounds very silly because, well, where do texts come from? Well, all texts have authors, right? But that wasn't something that ever occurred to me growing up reading these texts, was that someone actually wrote them. And so I think the freedom that I've had, that I found in the academic study of these pieces, is really just trying to discover what those authors were after, right? And so to the extent that we can know that, right? What is this author doing? And really, more importantly, situating these texts in those original contexts and allowing them to say things that are surprising to us, right? Maybe the Magi story isn't about an encounter with the divine, or maybe that's not the way Matthew intended it, but also being able to kind of separate that out and also say, well, but that's how people throughout, the past 2,000 years have understood it. So yeah, for me, I think that that really having to wrestle with that context, with that first century context, has really allowed me to ask more interesting questions about the text. And the fact that my scholarship is very much done apart from any ecumenical or ecclesial commitments, right? So, I get questions from my students all the time, like, what are you? Well, I mean, in this class, I'm a scholar of ancient literature, right? And my ecclesial commitments are not really affecting, what I'm doing. But that's a roundabout way of, I think, answering your question.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I think it's helpful because people have all sorts of different reactions when they discover that there was an author to the text,
Right.
and that kind of thing. Now, how does that kind of classroom and vocational role change the way you introduce these texts you spend so much time with to your kids? Like you mentioned, going to the Advent musical and that kind of thing. I know my kids have a very different experience than most of their peers because both of their parents went to divinity school,
Right.
and then their dad did a Ph.D. So how has those resources changed the way you introduce them to the text and traditions that you were handed, informed by it?
So, I mean, I guess I tend to just try to be honest with my kids whenever they ask me a question. And so if and they don't, maybe this is just because my answers are typically very complicated, but they generally don't ask me questions about these characters, right? When we were at the Advent play the other day, my oldest is currently reading this book, but the other two, I mean, they're 8 and 3, so they don't really care too much about what's going on there. But I mean, I think that it certainly has prompted me, if one of my kids ever says, were these people real characters? I think the best question that you can ask a kid when they ask a question like that is to say, well, what do you think and why? And so, yeah, maybe, or no, or whatever, but to really kind of steer them in that direction of the question is important. And also then the more important question of, well, what does this text mean? Regardless of whether they're real people, what does this text mean? And I think that is ultimately a more honest answer than, well, of course they're real because they're in the Bible.
Yeah. Has it's spending so much time with even just these particular parts of one of the Christmas stories changed what goes through your mind as you get to the holiday season in theological scare quotes?
I have always loved Christmas. I mean, what person doesn't really love Christmas, I guess? I should say, what vanilla Methodist doesn't enjoy Christmas?
Yeah.
I've always really loved Christmas. And I think that one of the things that I've always loved about it is this kind of, I wouldn't have described it this way in my earlier years, but this sort of mythology of the whole thing. And I do love that kind of sense of mystery and the kind of, I do love the story. It is a beautiful story. And so, I mean, I guess there's a reason why my research has kind of focused on infancy stories. You know, my dissertation was on the Proto-Gospel of James, which is an infancy story of Jesus and Mary, and then this book. But a lot of my my research focuses on the birth of Jesus and the stories around the birth of Jesus. And so, it certainly has complicated. There's that word again. It's made my understanding and my relationship with the holiday a lot more complicated, but I feel like it is a holiday that I have grown to appreciate even more and really enjoy even more. Right. When we talk about, like, I get this question around this time of year of, like, you know, what is the relationship of Christmas to, like, you know, Sol Invictus and, you know, Saturnalia and all of these kinds of things. I'm like, well, those are real dynamics that are going on in the ancient world, and knowing about those dynamics and how the kind of, you know, how the debate plays out and the timing of Christmas around the solstice and all that. I mean, that gives me a greater appreciation. I enjoy the holiday even more that I think about those kinds of dynamics.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you, in spending time with the apocryphal texts, are there a particular one that if you got to sub out one part of the New Testament canon for one of the non-canonical texts you like to spend time with, what kind of trade are you going to do? I know you kind of milquetoast Methodists probably haven't considered changing canon recently, but you got let's say you got one of those, you got sweet red shoes from the Pope, and he's like, Eric, I'm going to tag you in. We just need to fix something. We're going to tag one out. Tag one of these non-canonical, a little freshener up.
Yeah.
What's the switcheroo you're going to do?
Oh, well, I mean, this is obviously it's going to be an obvious answer for anyone who has been listening to the last hour and 40 minutes or so, but also anyone who knows what I work on. I love the Proto-Gospel of James. I think it's a fascinating text. And I think one of the reasons I like it is that it's first and foremost focused on Mary rather than Jesus. I mean, Jesus is a character, but it is the author's primary interest is on Mary. And that is a piece of the story of early Christianity that I think a lot of Protestants are not really fully appreciative of, is you know, Mary's kind of role in this whole in this whole thing. And so I like the idea of there being a text that tells her story, or at least tries to tell her story from a, you know, there are problems with the way that it tells her story, but I like that there is a text out there that asks the question of, wow, okay, if Jesus is God, what must his mother have been like, right? Like, what sort of a woman gives birth to God? A pretty special one. And so, you know, I think that's ultimately what that author is asking is, you know, who gives birth to God, you know, and she's a uniquely spectacular person in that text. And so I would say putting that, do I have to choose one to take out?
Oh yeah. Yeah. And then you never have to introduce this in your New Testament classes again, because it's just sitting there on a shelf in a apocryphal textbook.
It's really, really, it's so tricky. I would say either Romans or Hebrews.
Oh, yeah. Well, either. I mean, you know, I think I'd stick Hebrews out before I got rid of Romans, because I mean, there's never been such a high quality road to witness to people than the Roman road. I mean, it's just so simple and clear. It captures all of biblical Christianity in like a few statements.
Yeah,
and
that's true.
Does the Proto-Gospel of James? No, there's no 4 spiritual laws right there.
It's true. It's true. Yeah. No, I think it depends on the day, really, of whether I'm taking out Hebrews or whether I'm taking out Romans. It's a lot of responsibility, though, this decision.
Yeah.
I'll have to think about it a little bit.
I know that. Well, you dream about it just like the Magi and see which way you go. Now, you know, outside of this particular book, you spend time broadly looking at some of our contemporary kind of ethical questions, dynamics of power, and such in ancient texts. And in looking at how those texts are both were generated in their present situation and then interpreted over time, it brings, you kind of bring to the fore the interpretations, hermeneutics, and such can function as a priori justifications of perverse power. And in looking in wrestling with ancient texts, asking a number of kind of contemporary ethical questions, what are the ways to do that well versus, say, the common ways you see ancient texts get brought into contemporary ethical questions, be it, the kind of political ones, race, class, gender, these kinds of things.
Right.
How do we use ancient texts well versus kind of, appropriating their authority for whatever our current tribe's opinion is?
Right. Well, and so I'll focus on one issue that kind of popped up as you were asking the question, the issue of anti-Semitism, or what I call in this book Judeophobia, and this is a question that I've been thinking about as part of a bigger project. I'm co-editing a book right now with Sarah Rollins and Meredith Warren that's going to be talking about Judeophobia and Judeophobia and the New Testament, to talk about the ways that these texts have facilitated and encouraged this kind of anti-Jewish attitude. So, I think that the way that these texts get used badly is when you have, let's say, either Christian readers or just sort of, the political leaders today, or Christian readers or political leaders who are saying negative things about Jews, and there's plenty of this. I mean, there's this book isn't coming out of just random, whatever. I mean, if you look at the Twitter feeds of Congress people, I mean, it's filled with anti-Semitism. Really, anytime George Soros is mentioned, you can count on that being an anti-Semitic trope about how they control the media and they're, whatever. And so can you get these sorts of anti-Jewish attitudes from the New Testament? Yes, right. You can get these things because in the Passion stories, right, his blood be on us and our children. This idea of the Jews being responsible for the death of Jesus ultimately. Now, I'll restate this a few times because I'm always terrified of sound bites. This is not my view. This is the view of other people. And so can you get that from Matthew? Can you get that from other New Testament authors? Absolutely, you can. But I think that the way that we use these texts well is to say, okay, let's look and see what is the situation that Matthew is addressing here, and what is that context? Who is Matthew talking about when he's talking about his blood be on us and our children, right? Is he talking about all Jews everywhere at all times? Very unlikely. Well, but who is he talking about, right? And so to ask that question of, when you get to these texts, who's in charge, who isn't in charge, what are the debates that are going on, what are the tensions, and to say, okay, these texts were written to a certain point in time, and that doesn't mean that what they say is necessarily okay, but it sort of helps us to understand that the way we think about people, the way we think about dignity, groups of people, these sorts of things today is different, and that's okay, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that there's a tendency, for religious people in the present to go scouring whatever they call authority and then labeling their prejudice final, right, by picking. And this is even true for, like, if you hang out with your liberal Methodist friends, as a graduate of Claremont, they kind of only know the three parts of the Bible, the parts Martin Luther King Jr. quoted, Galatians chapter 3, neither nor, male, female, all that. They know that part down. And Matthew 25, it's the only time judgment gets used with liberal Protestants without them crying and getting upset, right? So, and look, and I like all three of those because I'm definitely a liberal Protestant. But I just say, like sometimes the inability to because we may treasure a tradition, we forget that the texts are actually foreign to our world. And I think that's one of the gifts scholarship gives us, is to make it strange again, so that there's now a gap where we have to wrestle, interpret, and take responsibility for the task of interpreting.
Right. And that is, I think that's, making these texts strange again. I got, there was and even really like acknowledging the amount of work and the amount of scholarship that has gone into even enabling the broader public to read these texts, right? I got a bunch of pushback a little while ago from a few non-liberal Protestant and Catholic circles when I tweeted something about the kind of clarity. There's this issue, right, of the Bible is clear, the Bible is clear, the Bible is clear, and I made some cheeky comment about reading Matthew, and then I posted a picture of a papyrus that has holes all over it. Was like, fine, let's talk about Matthew, and everyone was like, "Are you saying that's the whatever?" It was just a whole thing. But I mean, it is a really, really important point when we are reading Matthew. Heck, when I'm reading Matthew, and I'm reading Matthew from my Greek New Testament, I am reading a critical edition of Matthew, and I am not a textual critic, so I am relying on the work of people who are a lot more meticulous than I am, and who are a lot more they're a lot better at that than I am, and I'm relying on their work. So how much more are people who are not reading the Bible in Greek or Hebrew, how much more are they relying not only on the textual critics, but on the translators, right? And so to kind of introduce that strangeness and say, these are old texts, they're 2,000 years old. And just like Matthew does not understand a rapping camel, I don't care how good that camel raps, Matthew's going to look at that and go, what is this, right? We're looking at their world in very, very similar ways. And that's hidden a lot, I think, because everything in the Bible looks so smooth because of the translation factor.
Yeah. Well, that's helpful. Yeah. I've really enjoyed hanging out with you.
Same.
The excellent book. Everyone should go check it out. The Magi. You don't have to read it all to buy your friends copies. That's what Fortress said to say. So there we go. No, but any final thoughts or where people should connect with you and such?
People can connect with me. I'm pretty easy to find online, so feel free to send me an email if you've got any questions or thoughts. Social media, I'm pretty active on Twitter, and so you can find me there. My handle is just at Vanden Eykel. So I'd love to connect with you in either of those media.
Sweet.
All right.
All
Thanks,
righty.
Trip. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right.